Fantastic. Once again, welcome to today's official launch of the latest IPES-Food report, Food from Somewhere, Building Food Security and Resilience Through Territorial Markets. My name is Raj Patel. I am a research professor at the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin, but much more importantly, I am a member of IPES-Food, the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. For those who may not be acquainted with IPES-Food, we are an independent, cross-disciplinary panel of scientists and experts shaping debates about how to transition to sustainable food systems around the world. In this online launch event, we will present the main findings from our recently released report and present concrete policy recommendations about what can be done to build and strengthen territorial markets and food systems. Now, I'm keen for us to get right into the discussion. So let me tell you how this hour is going to go. In the first hour, we will listen to presentations by Jennifer Clapp and Shalmali Guttal, two of IPES-Food's experts responsible for this report. This will be followed by a brief question and answer session in the audience. And then after the Q&A, we will move into an hour of regional discussion groups. There'll be 4 groups: North America and Europe together, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Each of these regional discussions will be hosted by an IPES panel member. Émile Frisson will guide the discussion for North America and Europe. Sofia Monsalve will guide the one for Latin America. Susan Chomba will do Africa, and Shalmali Guttal will do South and Southeast Asia. In these regional groups, participants can discuss what they see as opportunities in their regions to support territorial markets and what, if anything, they may wish to do and to self-organize around next steps. Final technical note, please ask your questions to the speakers via the Q&A tool. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A tool and a chat. Please use the Q&A, the questions tool. The chat is really for technical questions only. So let's begin straight away with the first of our speakers. Jennifer Clapp is a member of the IPES-Food panel. She's a professor and the Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability, which she holds at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And she's a member also of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. Now, throughout her career, Jennifer has focused on the global governance of problems that arise at the intersection of the global economy, environment, and food security. And in particular, her research and her books have centered on questions of how economic policies can make can foster better food security and environmental sustainability goals at a global scale. She takes an interdisciplinary approach, combining insights from political science, international relations, economics, history, environmental studies, and food studies. And she holds a PhD in international political economy from the London School of Economics. Shalmali Guttal is a member of the IPES Food panel and executive director of Focus on the Global South, an activist think tank in Asia, providing analysis and building alternatives for just social, economic, and political change. For over 25 years, her research and writing has concerned economic and social development in Asia, particularly in the Mekong region and in India. Her academic background is in the social sciences, with particular emphasis on participatory education and qualitative research. The central themes of her work are community resources rights, women's rights, food sovereignty, agrarian reform, and democratization of governance. She works in solidarity with progressive grassroots movements, unions, and activists on the creation and governance of natural, social, and knowledge commons. So bang on time with that. Jennifer, I wonder if you can take us away.
Thank you very much, Raj. And I'll let the slide appear. I hope everybody can see it. I think, yeah, I'm seeing the presentation mode, so I hope it's showing up properly. Right. So I'll get started. We would like to first thank the participants of 3 regional IPES-Food dialogues on territorial markets that we held in early 2023 with peoples and organizations from Latin America, North America, and South and Southeast Asia. We'd also like to acknowledge the foundational work of the civil society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, of the Committee on World Food Security, as well as the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa and others who provided important work on which we built for this report. Their knowledge, insights, and lived experience greatly enriched this report. I think the slides are still working themselves out here. But I think it's okay if I get started because this is all preambulatory information. So the report follows on from the long food movement report that was completed by IPES-Food and the etc. group several years ago. And that report looked at the long-term systemic changes needed to transform our inequitable and unsustainable global food system. And the situation over recent years through the pandemic, conflicts, and climate shocks has become even more dramatic, with rising food insecurity and market chaos. For instance, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, global food prices spiked by 15%. These recent events have spurred policymakers around the world to question how to reduce dependency on volatile global markets and to strengthen food self-sufficiency. Further, they have raised important questions about how people are actually fed and by whom, prompting us to ask the important question, which is the foundation of this report: in this century of crisis, what kinds of food supply chains and markets can build resilience and help fulfill the right to food, nourishing people around the world more sustainably and equitably? Next slide, please. So to anchor our analysis, the report lays out what we mean by resilience. And of course, this is the important question. We have to define it. And this is especially important as this term is being widely appropriated and misused, often by large corporations. And our focus on resilience helped us to identify the essential elements of this kind of food, of the kind of food systems we need to face the future, and to assess the current models against these criteria. One theme that rose to the top in our analysis is the need to center power. And through this lens of power, we must ask, resilience for whom and in service of what broader goals? This report focused on resilience that delivers food security and livelihood security and ecological sustainability benefits for the many and not the few. We focused in particular on the needs of small-scale food providers and workers and for other marginalized populations. And as you'll see on the slide, we organized our analysis around three aspects of resilience in particular. And these are three big clusters that we set out criteria for our evaluation. The first is resilient livelihoods, communities, and cultures. And here we focused on criteria such as autonomy and agency, diversity, social cohesion and local food cultures, and equity and access. A second key bundle of resilience criteria that we looked at was with respect to resilient environments. And here we focused on criteria such as ecological integrity and the protection of biodiversity. And the third big cluster of resilience criteria that we looked at was the ability of food systems to weather and adapt to shocks. And here our criteria specifically for evaluation was flexibility and redundancy, the management of connectivity, and preparedness. And all of these three bundles of criteria around resilience are, of course, necessarily need to be underpinned by an adequacy of resources. And these resilience attributes overlap closely with the elements of agroecology as defined by the FAO. And further, the centering of power relations and attributes like autonomy and agency in particular overlap with the concept of food sovereignty, where these are important embedded norms. And there's also critical synergies with the concept of food security, emerging conceptions of which now also center agency and sustainability. Next slide, please. We then explored the relationship between corporate food chains, food security, and food system resilience. Most importantly, corporate value chains are not fundamentally designed to nourish people, nor to ensure access to food. For instance, a huge share of the food produced in the corporate value chain is diverted to bioenergy, to animal feed, or converted into energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods, including, increasingly, ultra-processed foods. Some estimates put the contribution of these corporate value chains to food security as low as 30%. In other words, the majority of the people are being fed by other means. And we'll discuss this more later in the presentation. And so what we're seeing is that the corporate value chains in the food system are lacking the resources for adequate nutrition for all. Meanwhile, corporate value chains also generate risks and vulnerabilities, and we must be aware of these. Corporate value chains are fragile. They're highly concentrated. They have long, opaque supply chains and operate on just-in-time logistics. And these attributes of the corporate value chains make them particularly prone to disruption. And we've seen this in recent years, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And these corporate global supply chains in the food system also work to undermine resilience. They drive environmental degradation by prioritizing large-scale industrial agriculture. They threaten livelihoods of small-scale producers, as we see highly uneven power dynamics within that system. And they also undermine dietary diversity and health because they tend to drive this monocultural, not only production, but also consumption. Next slide, please. So I'd like to say a little bit more about concentration because we focus on this in the report in establishing the importance of territorial markets, which Shamali will talk about in a minute. But with respect to concentration, it's important to recognize just how concentrated these corporate value chains are. And these are data from the global level, but we know that just 7 grain traders control at least 50% of the global grain trade. 6 major corporations control around 78% of the agrochemical market and 58% of the global seed market. And the top 8 carriers of freight account for more than 80% of the market for ocean freight capacity. And globally, 1% of the world's largest farms control 70% of the world's farmland. And these are the global figures. And sometimes when we look at the national level, these aspects of concentration are even more pronounced. And that's particularly for the corporate value chains. So all told, corporate value chains represent a huge and damaging concentration of power in the global food system, with shareholders and venture capitalists focused on driving up profits, often at the expense of people and the planet. So our research for this report underscored the extent to which corporate food chains dominate narratives and policies. A vast majority of governmental and intergovernmental policymaking in terms of agricultural subsidies, trade and investment agreements, tax breaks, and infrastructure all work in the service of corporate food chains. Next slide, please. And it's clear to us from our analysis that these corporate value chains are highly vulnerable to shocks, as I'd already mentioned, undermining food security and resilience. But despite these risks and negative outcomes, corporate value chains continue to grow. And by doing so, they further consolidate power and resources in the hands of dominant actors, threatening not only resilience, but also democracy, and posing a major challenge for government oversight of food systems. And this fragility is illustrated by the fact that we've seen repeated food crises as reliance on global supply chains has increased via the growing international trade in food and corporate concentration in the food system. So as these trends of the globalization of food trade and concentration have become more pronounced, we've seen more frequent and more intense crises as we've experienced in recent years. And although there's been some food price relief in recent months from the food price inflation unleashed by this most recent crisis, many people in many parts of the world are still finding it very difficult to access food and lack the capacity to obtain a healthy diet. Next slide, please. So as is clear from the latest figures from the SOFI report, the State of Food Insecurity in the World report, we are not making progress to end world hunger. And I know we're all familiar with these statistics, but just a reminder, today, nearly 800 million people face chronic undernourishment. 2.3 billion people face moderate or severe food insecurity, which is almost 30% of the population. 2.8 billion people could not afford a healthy diet in 2022. And meanwhile, over 2 billion people are overnourished, meaning they're overweight or obese, and 2 billion people suffer from one or more forms of micronutrient deficiency. So again, just to repeat, as these corporate global food supply chains have expanded, and become more concentrated, we are actually going backwards in terms of our objective to meet SDG 2 to end hunger and promote sustainable food systems by 2030. So as these sobering statistics make clear, growing reliance on concentrated corporate supply chains is not feeding the world. These corporate-dominated supply chains are vulnerable to disruption, and over-relying on them has contributed to a stagnation in progress to address hunger and malnutrition around the world. And so with that, I'm now going to pass on to Shalmali Guttal to present the remainder of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and a very warm good evening to all of you from Thailand. I hope you can hear me and see me all right. Now, moving on, we can see that our report, when we were doing the research for our report, we found that as much as 70% of food production and provisioning takes place largely or wholly out of corporate food chains. And in what we understand and elaborate as territorial food systems and territorial markets. So the majority of our report focuses on these supply chains that are often overlooked, but which actually feed most of the world. And our slide shows some examples of territorial markets, which there's much more nuance in the report than we can actually present here. Now, territorial markets are closer to home food supply chains. These are vibrant food provisioning spaces. They can be formal and informal. These are places where relationships are built, where small-scale food producers, smallholders, small-scale vendors and processors are in positions of significant autonomy. They're characterized by diversity of actors involved, as well as the kinds of food that are provisioned in these markets. They're multifunctional, extending well beyond economic exchange to social, cultural, medicinal, and other functions, including, of course, environmental and biodiversity functions. Critically, they're rooted in territories and communities within them. They offer food, what we say, they offer food from somewhere, as opposed to nameless food from nowhere that we're getting through corporate food systems and corporate supply chains. Territorial markets, for us, we say it's a wider concept than local food markets, because these markets encompass local, regional, and trans-border channels. In 2016, the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism of the Committee on World Food Security published a report about connecting smallholders to markets. And in this report, the mechanism elaborated the concept of territorial markets. And since then, the term and the concept have been gaining momentum in a number of policy and research circles. Now, this said, the very diversity and local rootedness of territorial markets, that is their strength, also makes it harder to define, measure, and generalize about them, as then is possible for me to present here. And you can see from the slide that territorial markets take different forms. We did try some classification to organize the different channels, from public markets and street vendors, to cooperatives, urban agriculture, to online direct sales, food hubs, state food purchasing. And many food producers use more than one of these marketing channels. Some food provisioning channels, like wholesale markets and even supermarkets, are also closely connected with corporate value chains, but they can be structured to better support territorial provisioning. And there is, of course, great potential in the public sector through mechanisms like public procurement to support territorial markets, but I'll come to that later. Next slide, please. Now, evidence shows that territorial markets build food security and resilience on multiple fronts, demonstrating increased food access, health, equity, and environmental outcomes. From the point of view of food security, territorial markets play a crucial role in making food accessible and affordable, especially for low-income populations in the global south. Now, the African Food Sovereignty Alliance's study, a Pan-African study that they did, showed that public market food pricing was affordable and negotiable and much cheaper than at supermarkets. Territorial markets also tend to be better suited to the broader needs and preferences of low-income and marginalized populations, allowing for the purchase of small and flexible quantities of food, for price bargaining, informal credit arrangements, and also being located in and or near low-income neighborhoods. Some territorial markets are also working to further enhance affordability through vouchers, nutrition coupons, healthy food prescriptions, and pricing schemes to support equity and also to guarantee access. In Africa, poor urban households buy most of their food from the street or from other types of informal markets, with similar findings for the urban poor in Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And territorial markets are vital in delivering a measure of food security to the most vulnerable populations. And the report shares data and examples from around the world. Next slide, please. Thanks. Now, territorial markets support key aspects of food system resilience. So they support resilient livelihoods, communities, and cultures through decent prices and steady incomes for producers, including women and youth. So, for example, in Thailand, green farmers markets offer producers higher margins than big retailers do. And these green farmers markets account for about 60 to 80% of the income of small-scale food producers. In the United States, decades of cooperative-led organizing among Southern Black farmers have facilitated about $80 million of sales and 175,000 acres of Black-owned land that has been secured for food, small-scale food production. Territorial markets sustain traditional food cultures and foster community, and they ensure access to seasonal, diverse, and more nutritional food and diets. An FAA mapping by the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, of public markets in 7 countries noted a range from 47 to over 100 kinds of unprocessed foods available across the surveyed markets per country. Territorial markets support resilient environments through environmental sustainability and biodiversity, and they are the main sources for diverse indigenous seeds. Urban gardeners in Quito, in Ecuador, grow on average 43 different horticultural species, including heirloom varieties. And we see this kind of diversity in horticulture across Asia as well. They are designed to weather and adapt to shocks. They demonstrate high degrees of adaptability. And in Brazil, during the COVID pandemic, some 45% of emergency food supply initiatives were based on local supply chains, and over 85% were at least partly agroecological. In India, during the COVID pandemic, the government of the state of Kerala set up 1,000 what were called Janakiya hotels run by an all-women network, the Kudumshri, with ingredients sourced from the Kudumshri local production program. Now, moving, next slide, please. So here we see a side-by-side comparison from the report, so from our report of corporate supply chains on one hand and territorial markets. You can take a look, just take maybe a few seconds to take a quick scan at this slide. I won't read it out. But yet, despite this clear picture, government policies are propping up fragile, disaster-prone global supply chains, and they're undermining localized food systems. So in the following slides, let's look at we'll look at more in more detail the barriers faced by territorial markets. Next, please. Sorry, have you moved to the next slide? Oh. Yes, thank you. Sorry. Yeah. So now, as the report demonstrates, territorial markets are the backbone of food systems in many countries and regions, and yet their existence and growth are threatened because of multiple barriers. They are being eroded by corporations, supermarkets, and governments also who think that bigger is better. Agricultural subsidies, trade and investment agreements, tax breaks, and food supply infrastructures are skewed towards large-scale industrial export agriculture. And localized food supply chains and markets lack investment in supportive policies and infrastructure, from basic clean water and sanitation facilities to access to finance, adequate storage, and marketplaces. Now, some of these challenges are local and contextualized, but others are rooted in broader global systems and structures. Now, in this slide, we show 4 concrete barriers, which are identified in the report, which hold back territorial markets. So first, we see that there are pervasive inequalities, exploitation, and discrimination across the global food system. Food access is still a challenge in many contexts because of a broad lack of adequate social protection and entitlements. Territorial markets are regularly subject to closures, eviction, and other forms of violent discrimination. And women, for whom territorial markets are especially important, face a specific set of barriers, including bearing an unequal burden of the unpaid care economy, which then also serves as a barrier for them to participate in markets and the territorial markets. We see also a lack of scale-appropriate infrastructure and finance for territorial markets. This includes physical, digital, and social infrastructure and planning processes, and 70% of smallholders' needs for financing go unmet, and in Africa, less than 10% have access to formal credit. We also have unfavorable policies and in general, across the markets, and corporate norms are setting the rules. So for example, health, hygiene, and certification standards are developed according to the norms of industrial food systems and large corporations and companies, not according to localized and territorially embedded food systems. And finally, we're seeing how corporations are dominating how we use and understand terms to the point where they become meaningless. So for example, we see many, the use of the term local to mean many different things. Farmers' markets sometimes become spaces where food is being sold from global supply chain. They don't benefit the farm, they don't benefit the small-scale farmers, but they capitalize on the positive feelings that people may have towards the term farmers' markets. Next slide, please. Now, territorial markets are also challenged by widespread systemic biases that favor an understanding of food markets, agriculture, supply chains, and trade set by corporations, and the logic of industrial agriculture. So these include international trade and investment agreements, which broadly favor big business, while finance, credit, infrastructural support flows to export-driven, large-scale monocrop production. Intellectual property regimes and seed legislation favors industrial agriculture and corporate commodity chains. Powerful corporations dominate food system discourse in a way that reinforces their power and discredit territorial markets. This includes the growing perception that food should be cheap, which is used to strengthen corporate value chains and their very damaging practices. And also there's an erosion of place-based food cultures that underpin some of the territorial markets. Next slide, please. Now, territorial markets can serve to push back against the social, cultural, spatial, ecological, and economic disintegrations of the more extractive capitalist food systems. But to unlock the full potential of territorial markets and to build a more resilient food future, the IPES-Food panel identifies a series of actions that need to be taken together by governments. And these include, for example, protecting local markets from corporate co-optation, including breaking up supply chain monopolies and supporting inclusive governance models, shifting subsidies to invest in the infrastructure, networks, and people that underpin and participate in territorial markets, including public marketplaces, collectives and cooperatives, rural development, training, and scale-appropriate ICT. Also putting resilient local food networks at the heart of social and anti-hunger policies and planning for future shocks. Another important action is redirecting public procurement and state purchasing schemes to support sustainable small-scale food producers and processors. And of course, encouraging sustainable biodiversity. Seen that a diverse web of closer-to-home supply chains and markets are feeding most of the world. They're reaching low-income populations. They're sustaining the livelihoods of farmers and communities. They're nurturing biodiversity. And they are providing a lifeline to millions of producers and consumers in times of crisis. Now, very importantly, also closer-to-home chains are bringing food to markets at prices that are accessible to low-income groups, as well as being remunerative for producers. That is, that they offer, facilitate, and enable fair prices that corporate chains have systematically failed to deliver. And yet at the same time, we see that their ability to continue to play these roles into the future is under perpetual strain. Corporate chains have few solutions to offer, yet they're gradually displacing and or assimilating other modes of provisioning. And this is happening in a context of deteriorating food and nutritional security, the rise of diet-related disease, sustained food price inflation and supply shocks, which Jennifer already touched on, where people need healthy, diverse, and accessible food provision options more than ever. So to meet the needs of today and to be prepared for the inevitable crisis on the horizon, it is critical that diverse resilience and resilient building food systems and supply chains and markets be better understood and recognized for the many benefits that they deliver. These markets can weather shocks and deliver resilience because they're rooted in communities, landscapes, and cultures, and because they empower diverse networks of people to deliver food sovereignty and food security. So going forward, we have everything to gain by advancing the leverage points outlined above in support of territorial markets, and providing appropriate support for these systems would allow them to deliver further benefits for food security, equity, and ecological health, reinforcing their role as the cornerstone of food security, food sovereignty, and climate resilience for years to come. So in conclusion, the IPES-Food panel is calling for urgent policy shifts to curb the power of corporate food chains and to bring supply chains and markets closer to home. Thank you very much. And I give the floor back to Raj.
Thank you, Sharmili, and thank you, Jennifer, for those excellent presentations. I'm not going to, I'm now going to turn over to our audience. Unfortunately, we don't have the Q&A up and running, but if you could perhaps put your questions in chat, that would be terrific. And we've got already quite a lot to ask you in the next 20 minutes. Charles and Jennifer, maybe I can start off just by asking what a territorial market is. We've had a question about what metrics or definitions we might use to be able to recognize one. And maybe this is a good place to start of just defining what it is that we mean by a territorial market, and we'll get into how to get there. So I wonder if either of you feels ready to take that one on.
Jennifer, you go first. Great, thanks, Raj, and thanks for the question. I know there was one in the chat, but I can't pull it up right now. But yeah, just to say that the idea of territorial markets, it's in some ways obvious, because it's about food systems that are grounded in territory, local knowledge, culture, and relationships. But at the same time, territorial markets are also dynamic and fluid and can change over time. But the idea is thinking about territory, and this isn't necessarily within a national boundary. Territorial markets can cross borders. It's all about the kinds of organic local food trade relationships that have emerged within territories. So sharing languages, sharing knowledge, culture, food preferences. These are the kinds of people-centered territory that we think about with territorial markets. But they're, because they are unique in every instance, they're somewhat hard to sort of pin down and say these are the precise criteria. But that's our understanding and where we started. But it also made it challenging in the report, because we have to lay out, what exactly we meant. And so this is how we come to define territorial markets in the report. But I'm sure Shalmali wants to add some nuance to that response.
Thanks, Jennifer. I was just looking at the chat thing. I think you already explained why we picked the name. There is, the term was actually first elaborated, as I said in my presentation, by the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism of the Committee for World Food Security when we were working on a negotiating process on connecting smallholders to markets. So what the mechanism did was reached out to small-scale food producers and consumers and organizations all over the world, mobilized basically the entire network of the mechanism to say, okay, how are most of the people getting their food? How are most of people getting nutritious food? How are they getting seeds? What's sustaining people's livelihoods? And the response was quite amazing. There was an amazing array of different forms of marketing in different forms, which some of which we have described in our report, all the way from small local weekly, bi-weekly markets to regular place-based markets, public procurement, public markets, public procurement schemes, wandering itinerant vendors, and so on. And what was common across all of them was the way what was the functionality of these markets and a wide array of benefits and the wide array of contributions they were making, not only to the economy directly and to finances directly, but to the environment, to ecosystems, to nutrition, to livelihood, and to agency and self-worth, in many cases. And so it is from those experiences that the mechanism decided to call them territorial markets, that they're more than local foods markets. They're related to local food systems, but as you said, Jennifer, they're broader than they're not only local. And the territory can encompass a region, it can encompass an entire country, it can encompass 2 states, it can go cross-border. So I won't elaborate on this too much. We've explained it quite a lot in our report.
Thank you so much, Charles and Jennifer. Well, maybe we should go from the very small definition to the very biggest problem, which was really on the last slide that you presented, Charles. But I'd invite both of you to help us understand a little bit more about how we get from here to there. One of the sort of constraints of territorial markets is that often they've arisen in opposition to industrial food systems, and they have a very long history. I mean, here in the United States, the cooperative movement has some very deep roots in struggles against enslavement and the history of entrenched racism in the United States. And yet the industrial food system proceeds apace, and the consolidation is increasing, if anything. So we have in the report a number of suggestions. I'm wondering if I can invite you both to suggest a little bit more about what it is that needs to happen to be able to get us from where we are to where we need to be.
Jennifer, you go first.
I was going to suggest the same, Shal, but I'll take a stab at that. Yeah, I mean, coming to the big point you just raised, Raj, I think it's important as you recognize that territorial markets have long histories, they've been grounded in place and in cultures, and they've been vibrant and feeding people for a very, very long time. The thing is that because these markets are often informal, they haven't always been recognized as existing because they are not embedded within sort of like measurement and statistical systems. And so they've often been ignored in policy, and their important role in feeding people has not received the attention it deserves, I would say, within policymaking. But the concern is with the market power that exists within the global industrial food supply chains, because as corporate supply chains become larger and more concentrated, this lends more and more power to those firms that in a way takes up all the space, the policy space in the room, so to speak, and basically closes off those opportunities for territorial markets to thrive. So in other words, the market power that gives corporations that dominate these systems the capacity to adjust supply and demand in those corporate chains in a way that allows them to raise prices. They have buyer power, which allows them to push down the prices they pay to suppliers. They have the power to push down wages. They have the power to create barriers to entry into the marketplace. And so this whole, and also that they have the power to use those resources from their market power to actually influence policy and governance, as we outlined in our Tipping the Scales report last year. So as these corporate chains become more concentrated and expand, they're actually reducing the operating space and challenging the operating space for territorial markets to thrive. So they've always been there. They've always been feeding people, but there's more and more risk and more threat to these territorial markets. And so a big motivation for us in writing this report is to raise the flag on that issue, to say we need to protect the space within which territorial markets operate and accept and increase the kind of role that they play in society. So how do we get there? I mean, a big way, and I noticed in the chat some comments about the role of subsidies. So subsidies are often going to the large corporate value chains. They're often going to grain crops, for example, or other crops like cotton or peanuts, that are sort of big global traded commodities. And there needs to be more of a shift of subsidies towards the kinds of foods and markets that are actually feeding people. Imagine if all those subsidies were redirected towards fruits and vegetables that were eaten in local communities. Imagine they were shifted to infrastructure for these territorial markets. I mean, infrastructure is one of the biggest challenges for these markets, that access to safe water, to appropriate spaces to have these kinds of markets. And so shifting subsidies, I think, is extremely important. And to do that, I think we have to make that message really clear that territorial markets are feeding people. They are feeding people more diverse diets. They are more resilient. And it is imperative that governments shift their subsidies. But part of getting that argument across is actually breaking the political power of those corporations, because they're using that lobby power to ensure that those subsidies stay with them and not with the smaller scale producers. I'm sorry I talked for too long, but I'm very passionate about this question.
No, absolutely, Jennifer. I mean, I'm glad you brought those points up and you spoke with the passion, because this is a very important issue to tackle. And the only thing I would add there on the issue of corporate power and industrial food systems is that they are both protected legally through international trade and investment agreements, and their interests are also protected through intellectual property regimes and seed legislation. And now with more and more, with the newer generation of free trade agreements, intellectual property rights and the breeders' rights, so-called breeders' rights legislation is becoming even more stringent with UPOF and so on. And so in many countries, seed sharing, seed saving is actually criminalized, which has which has a huge impact on local foods, seasonal foods, and so on. So on one hand, we see a legal level protection of corporate food supply chains and industrial system, agriculture systems. Then we also see an overall policy bias in terms of where, as you said, subsidies are directed and financing is directed, because there's also a sort of a results-based assessment of what will produce to scale, and how, linking the issue of scale and the outcomes that you get from it in terms of the amount of subsidies that are produced. And there, corporations kind of win out because they have the scale, and they're able to fan out, and they do that through exploitative practices, environmental contamination, pushing down labor prices. But they are able to say, look, with a much smaller amount of subsidy, we can produce so much more. And so there's a vicious cycle in there. And at the same time, we're also seeing the way corporations dominate the discourse. They dominate the discourse in terms of, for example, wet markets are unhealthy. a lot of local food system, I mean, a lot of local foods carry bacteria. When bird flu has broken out in Asia several times, the birds that are culled are those of small scale, poultry producers. Although bird flu, most often, or more often than not, broke out, the initial incidences were in industrial poultry farms. The people who paid the price for it were the small scale poultry producers. So there is this general idea that, wet markets, fresh markets, they're unhygienic, they're not clean. And therefore, this kinds of standards, the food and safety certification standards that corporations are developing are what are needed. So there's a number of, I would say, challenges there and a number of barriers that are legal and policy related, but also related to the kind of knowledge and discourse that's being spread around. So I think we need to work at both levels here, at the level of building the pressure from communities, from the public, to actually examine with real science and real outcomes in terms of where, what kinds of food systems, what kinds of marketing systems are actually feeding the world and providing nutrition and seasonally diverse food. There's also, of course, the issue of climate. Sorry, I'll stop here. I won't go into that.
Well, in fact, we have about 8 minutes left, and so this will be a good chance, maybe just again, Marshall and Jennifer, for concluding thoughts, but bearing in mind a couple of things that have already come up. I mean, a lot of the questions, we had a surprising number of questions about this issue of sanitation, of hygiene, of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And along with it has come the question and the suggestion that one of the ways to be able to move territorial markets forward is through the very concrete question of infrastructure. I mean, we've got the sort of flows of subsidy, but we've got the stocks of infrastructure that have been degraded in part by industrial, supply chains, and that points to the sort of bigger question of who are the leading actors in the transition from industrial to territorial markets. Who needs to be in the big tent as we move forward and imagine the push back against industrial markets and the recentering of territorial markets? Who are the leading actors? Is it the providers of infrastructure? Are there other people, other movements, other groups who are, obviously farmers pushing for higher prices in India, for instance? We've had a question about that. But who ought we to be allying with as we think about the future of the advancement of territorial markets? We've got about 3 minutes for each of you. And Charles, why don't you go first, since you're unmuted?
Okay. Well, I think the most important actors, I would say, are the small-scale food producers and the vendors and the processors. And I think all these actors these people who populate and who run territorial markets, and it's a very important point in the chat, that a territorial market does not have to be a physical space. There are examples that we have in our report from Cambodia, for example, where women's cooperatives and fisheries make their own products, and there's an entire network of transporters that take those products to places at the other end of the country. So that's a classic example of a territorial market, which is not only rooted in one place. Similarly, there are the digital sales, there are digital access points, etc. So I think one important thing here is to get those who are participating in these territorial markets in different kinds of markets together, and have them talk directly to policymakers, have them talk directly with the public. And I think consumer pressure and public pressure here is extremely important. We need to get also on the table, we need to get healthcare providers, we need to get nutritionists. We need to make that connection between ecological health, environmental health, animal health, and food health and human health. And see, what is it, compare them, do an actual true analysis of how, where the benefits, the multifunctional benefits of the different food systems are coming. Because there's just too much bogus science running around. And bogus science that is self-referential, graphs that just keep referring to each other. And I'm sure people like Jennifer will look at them and will be able to tear them apart in a minute. But the thing is that mythology, it's not even a mythology, mythologies are actually very positive, but these lies continue. So yeah, I think if I had to get a bunch of people in a room together, I would get policymakers, I would get the small scale food producers and vendors, and I would get other health practitioners and environmental practitioners and researchers who would then look and do a true cost analysis and a true sort of outcomes analysis comparing these different systems. Because I think these lies have to be debunked. Over.
Charles.
Yeah, just to add to what I totally agree with Shal, that I mean there are different actors that need to be part of this conversation and bring on board producers, public health actors, etc. But I think the challenge with the territorial markets is that each one is unique, and so the specific actors that might be champions of pushing for changes to subsidy policies and etc. They might be different in different cases, and that's puts territorial markets at somewhat of a disadvantage compared to the corporate supply chains, where these large corporate actors, they're often working together in unison to lobby for policy changes that benefit their bottom line that often are disadvantaging the territorial markets. So there's room for engagement with local food policy councils, but also I think there's room to develop networks of these local food policy councils to work together on common strategies to push for these kinds of changes. And I just wanted to say something as well on the sanitary question, and I think that's really important because as Shal mentioned, there's this sort of narrative out there that farmers markets and local markets are maybe less sanitary than these sort of hermetically sealed corporate supply chains. But we have to remember as well that every year there are multiple problems within these corporate value chains on the sanitary front. We hear, oh, there's a listeria outbreak in a soy milk plant, and several people died. There's outbreaks of E. coli in spinach or in meat. These are constantly happening in the global corporate supply chains, and yet the response doesn't seem to be, oh, we need to do something about keeping those better. It's more, picking on the territorial markets. Of course, historically there have been foodborne illnesses in food supply chains of all sorts, but we have to recognize that as these corporate supply chains get larger and larger and more centralized, if something goes wrong, the impacts are spread far and wide and they affect a lot of people. They're often very difficult to identify and pinpoint where the problem is happening. And so I just think that we need to debunk that myth about the local markets. The local markets can be, if they're better resourced with sources of clean water and better infrastructure for sanitation, they can be just as, if not more, safe than the corporate supply chains. And we really need to work towards that goal. And again, that's something that advocates for territorial markets can push for in terms of their engagement with policymakers. And I see the time's at 10, so I'll stop talking.
Nailed it, both of you. Thank you so much. Everyone in the audience, you can see why it's just such a pleasure to work at IPES-Food with colleagues like this. Your brain's always fizzing with excitement, and then everyone keeps to time. It's magic. What's going to happen now is that we're going to do what IPES is really moving into being a pioneer in, which is not just presenting a report, but now starting to build the constituencies and the teams that are going to be able to make change happen. And we're going to do that in our regional groupings. This is going to be just a little bit tricky because if you're interested in joining the Africa discussion, which will be held in English and in French, all you have to do is nothing, just stay here. If you would like to join the Europe and North America discussion, which will be in English, Or if you would like to join the Asia discussion, which will also be in English, then look down to the bottom of your Zoom screen and you'll see something that says breakout rooms. Click on the breakout room and then pick either Asia or North America and Europe, and then you'll be able to join that. If you would like to join the Latin America group, which will be in English and Spanish and Portuguese, then unfortunately, you're going to have to leave this room and go to a different room. And that's, you'll see in the chat, I hope right now, the Zoom link. When you click on that, you'll be invited to leave this discussion and go to a different one. And before you do, just know that you won't be coming back here, and we're saying farewell to you. And so now's a good time to thank the team behind the translation, the team behind the scenes here at IPES, particularly if you're heading off to the Spanish room. So again, if you're in the Africa room, stay here. If the North America and Europe room, breakout room